The air in the Roman Forum was thick that day, not just with the usual aromas of baked bread, olive oil, and animal musk, but with something far less tangible, a quiet, rippling unease. Marble columns stood in rigid dignity under the weight of the midday sun, their shadows slicing across the plaza like dark spears. Peddlers called out prices for figs and pottery. Senators in pristine togas glided toward the curia, and beyond it all, an imperial procession cut straight through the heart of the city. At the center was Nero, emperor, artist. Self-proclaimed god, his tunic woven with threads so fine they caught the light like molten gold. The crowd bowed and murmured as he passed, their eyes drawn less to him than to the figure walking half a pace behind. Draped in silks dyed the rare purple reserved for imperial blood, adorned with gems from distant lands, the Empress moved with measured grace. At first glance, she seemed every inch the jewel of the Roman Empire, and yet, the whispers slithered through the forum like smoke. "That's no woman," hissed one merchant to another. "That's Sporus," came the hushed reply, a boy who had once served quietly in the palace, until the emperor decided to make him something else entirely. Those who dared speak at all kept their voices low, for the walls in Rome had ears. But no whisper could conceal the truth. Nero's bride had been forcibly remade, in the image of a dead woman. The dead woman had been Poppaea Sabina, Nero's wife, and, if his behavior was to be believed, the axis around which his world spun. And Sporus, barely more than a youth, had been chosen for one simple, horrifying reason. His face resembled hers. It was the sort of sight that burned itself into memory, the casual cruelty of it, wrapped in the trappings of imperial ceremony, the paradox of beauty and violence walking side by side through a city that had seen centuries of both. You might be tempted to file this away as another example of Roman excess, a salacious footnote in a long line of imperial scandals. But to do so would be to miss the deeper truth of truth that reaches well beyond the marble streets of 67 AD. This is not just a story about an emperor gone mad. It is about how power distorts love, how grief can curdle into obsession, and how identity can be stripped away until nothing remains but a performance for someone else's satisfaction. It is also a story that invites us to ask a deeply uncomfortable question. What would it take for you to stop being yourself? And would you even realize it was happening until it was too late? Before we unravel the fate of Sporus, we need to understand the man who orchestrated it all. Nero Claudius Caesar Augustus Germanicus was not born with the shadow of cruelty already upon him, at least, not in the way history sometimes suggests. When he came to power at just 16, Rome was prepared to embrace him as a golden boy of promise. The early years of his reign were almost disarmingly hopeful. Taxes were eased for the common people, public games were funded with imperial generosity, and Nero himself appeared before the public not as a distant autocrat, but as a man who seemed eager to share in their joy. He performed in the theater, sang on stage, and even took part in athletic contests. For a city weary of political intrigue, this youthful energy felt refreshing. Historians, especially those writing after his fall, have often portrayed this period as an illusion, a pleasant mask before the rot set in. But there is evidence that, at least for a while, Nero's intentions were genuine. Like many young rulers throughout history, he may have sincerely wanted to be loved. The problem is that the machinery of empire has a way of reshaping even the most earnest desires. To be emperor was to be both omnipotent and utterly alone. Every victory was credited to you, every failure blamed on someone else until it suited your enemies to reverse the story. Every person you knew wanted something from you: power, protection. Wealth, and the price of denying them could be deadly. In such an environment, trust was a luxury few could afford. Absolute power does not just corrupt, it isolates. The higher you rise, the thinner the air becomes, until you cannot tell whether you are breathing truth or flattery. This, more than any natural cruelty, was the soil in which Nero's later obsessions would grow. In the palace, surrounded by courtiers who measured every word, Nero's need for genuine connection must have been like a hunger that could never quite be satisfied. Enter Poppaea Sabina, a woman whose beauty was said to rival that of any goddess, and whose intelligence was sharp enough to cut through the honeyed lies of the court. When Nero met her, he was already bound in a politically convenient but emotionally barren marriage to Octavia, the daughter of the previous emperor. Octavia was dignified, quiet, and uninterested in courtly games, admirable qualities in many contexts. But they left Nero restless. Poppaea, by contrast, was a blaze of color in an otherwise monochrome world. She commanded attention the way a torch commands moths, and Nero was drawn into her orbit almost instantly. Their affair began in the usual Roman way: discreet meetings, carefully arranged encounters, and whispered rumors that passed through the palace like contraband. But it didn't take long for whispers to turn into open scandal. Nero's attraction to Poppaea was not the polite admiration of a statesman for a court beauty. It was an all-consuming fixation. Ancient sources describe him as growing increasingly possessive, to the point of paranoia. He placed guards around her under the pretext of protection, but their real function was surveillance. He showered her with treasures from across the empire, perfumes from Arabia, silks from China, gems from India, gifts not just of affection, but of ownership. Here's where the modern reader might begin to feel a strange sense of recognition. We've seen this pattern before, not in emperors, perhaps, but in public figures, celebrities, or even in personal relationships where admiration slips into control. It is a dangerous shift, the transformation of love into possession, of partnership into captivity. Poppaea, for her part, was no passive figure. She understood the dangerous privilege of Nero's attention. Beauty had given her a powerful role in the empire, but she was sharp enough to know it was a role that came with an expiration date. To protect herself, she began weaving a network of allies, family connections, influential friends, people who might shield her if Nero's affections ever soured. But if Poppaea had a flaw, it was that she did not temper her independence for the sake of Nero's ego. She challenged him in ways no one else dared. She critiqued his decisions, mocked his theatrical ambitions when they fell short, and spoke to him not as a god, but as a man. In the charged atmosphere of the imperial court, where most people survived by anticipating the emperor's moves and flattering his every whim, this was both refreshing and dangerous. And inevitably, it would lead to disaster. By 65 AD, the marriage between Nero and Poppaea had become the central drama of Rome's imperial stage. From the outside, it looked like a union of unmatched power and beauty, the emperor and his dazzling empress, united under the god's favor. Inside the palace, it was a different play, entirely a mix of passion, paranoia, and the suffocating intensity of two strong wills constantly colliding. Theirs was not a romance softened by time. It was a relationship locked in a cycle of grand gestures and bitter quarrels. Some arguments were over Nero's artistic performances, the empire's finances, the appointment of officials, but others were born from the smallest slights, the kind that only fester in relationships where every moment is magnified by public scrutiny. Then came the day that would fracture Nero's world. The details vary depending on which ancient historian you read. Tacitus claims Poppaea accused Nero of neglecting his duties as husband and father, scolding him for prioritizing the theater and chariot races over governance. Suetonius, never one to shy away from the lurid, tells of a sudden explosion of rage in which Nero, either by a violent kick or a brutal blow, struck Poppaea in the abdomen. Cassius Dio adds his own embellishments. What is consistent in these accounts is that Poppaea was pregnant at the time, and whatever happened in that heated moment ended both her life and the life of the unborn child she carried. We cannot know the truth. Ancient histories are never free from bias, especially when they describe fallen rulers. Some scholars have suggested that Poppaea's death could have been the result of illness or complications in pregnancy, later reframed as a crime to darken Nero's legacy. But the version that survived, and that is echoed through the centuries, is the one of violence. If that story is true, then imagine the scene, the echo of the strike, the stunned silence, the collapse of the woman who had held the emperor's heart in her grasp, the moments of disbelief as the reality set in, and then the unraveling. For all his ruthlessness, Nero did not meet this loss with cold detachment. Ancient accounts speak of an emperor transformed into a figure of pathetic desperation. He threw himself beside Poppaea's body, begging her to forgive him, commanding her to live as though imperial authority could overrule death. Physicians were summoned at once, offered wealth beyond measure if they succeeded, threatened with torment if they failed. But the effort was futile. Poppaea Sabina died within hours. With her went not only the child that might have secured Nero's bloodline, but also the one person whose presence had defined his emotional universe. Here, grief took a shape that was anything but healing. Nero refused to have her body burned, as Roman custom demanded. Instead, he had her embalmed and entombed in a mausoleum fit for a goddess. He declared her divine, establishing a cult in her honor. Days, possibly weeks, passed in which he would speak to her body as though she were still listening. The court was forced into a theater of denial. Poppaea's name was spoken in the present tense. Her seat at banquets remained empty, but was set as though she might arrive at any moment. To break the illusion was to risk exile or worse. It was in this period of fractured reality that Nero's gaze fell upon Sporus. Sporus was likely 14 or 15, born into slavery within the imperial household. Freed as a child, he had grown up in the rarefied environment of the palace, receiving an education suited for administrative service. In many ways, this was a privileged position compared to the lives of most Romans. Yet such privilege rested entirely on the emperor's goodwill, making it as fragile as a glass vessel balanced on the edge of a table. What drew Nero to Sporus was not his wit, nor his skill, but his face. Multiple sources note an uncanny resemblance to Poppaea, especially in the eyes and the fine structure of his features. In a society where physical likeness was often taken as a sign of deeper, even spiritual connection, this resemblance would have been startling. To Nero, deep in the grip of grief that had warped into obsession, it may have felt like a sign from the gods. Here was a chance to undo the irreversible. Here was the ghost of Poppaea, walking in flesh and blood. There was, of course, one obstacle. Sporus was male. But Nero, who had spent months speaking to a corpse and who believed himself touched by divinity, did not see this as an obstacle at all. He saw it as a problem to be solved. And in his world, problems were solved through command, regardless of the human cost. The decision he made next would turn Sporus' life into a nightmare from which there was no waking. Nero would not merely dress Sporus in women's clothing. He would have him remade physically, socially, and psychologically into Poppaea's replacement. The order went out for the empire's most skilled physicians. Sporus was taken into chambers prepared for the purpose. The procedure they were commanded to perform was as crude as it was final: castration. Roman surgical knowledge was primitive by modern standards. There was no true anesthesia, only mixtures of herbs or opium to dull the senses. The instruments, bronze scalpels, clamps, cautery irons, were effective but brutal. The risk of infection was enormous, the pain unimaginable. This was not a life-saving operation. It was an act of calculated mutilation. The physical consequences were permanent. Sporus would never father children, never fully develop the adult masculine traits his body was on the cusp of forming. The social consequences were equally inescapable. Roman society valued masculinity as a core of personal identity. To be castrated was to be marked as other, to lose a place in the hierarchy of men without gaining full acceptance among women. For Sporus, there was no choice, no negotiation. The boy who had grown up under the palace roof was now bound to it forever, in a role not of his choosing. When the procedure was done, and he had recovered enough to stand, the transformation began in earnest. Tailors fashioned gowns to flatter his altered body, borrowing designs from the garments Poppaea had once worn. Jewelers refitted imperial ornaments to his size, sometimes using the very gems that had adorned the dead Empress. Hairdressers worked for hours to shape his hair in elaborate styles that matched the fashions of Rome's elite women. This was not mere play acting. It was the systematic erasure of one identity and its replacement with another. Sporus was given lessons in posture, gesture, and speech, taught to move with the grace expected of a Roman noblewoman, to sit with knees together, and hands folded just so to speak in a higher register, and with the polished inflections of an empress. And all the while, Nero watched. For him, this was not a grotesque pantomime but a restoration. The dead had been brought back, and he would complete the illusion with ceremony. Plans for a wedding were set in motion, an imperial wedding, no less, with all the pomp and expense such an event demanded. The date would coincide with religious festivals, ensuring that the union would be surrounded by the weight of tradition and divine favor. It is tempting to read this as pure delusion, but there's also calculation here. By making Sporus his wife, Nero signaled to the court and to the empire that his grief had been answered by the gods, that his personal tragedy had been transformed into a renewal of imperial stability. The political message was as important as the personal fantasy. For Sporus, however, this was the moment his life became a living performance, one with no end in sight. The day of the wedding arrived not as a quiet, private arrangement, but as a spectacle designed to rival any in Rome's history. Nero understood the power of performance. He had, after all, spent years insisting on his role as both emperor and artisan. This event would serve as both a personal ritual and a political declaration. Invitations were sent to the highest-ranking senators, military commanders, and foreign dignitaries. Whether they approved or not was irrelevant. To decline such an invitation was to court ruin. The guests arrived in glittering processions, their faces schooled into masks of polite acceptance. At the heart of the ceremony stood Sporus, dressed in a gown woven with threads of gold. He wore a veil of translucent silk that softened the lines of his face, making the resemblance to Poppaea almost uncanny. Around his neck gleamed a necklace that had once belonged to her, a piece so recognizable that every person in the room would have known it. The officiant was not a priest, but Nero himself. In Roman marriage rites, the giving of the bride's hand was symbolic. Here, Nero inverted the ritual, taking Sporus's hand and placing a ring upon it, declaring him Sabina in honor of Poppaea's full name. Witnesses swore later that the emperor's eyes shone with genuine emotion, that for those moments he seemed entirely convinced this was a union of love, rather than the culmination of a calculated transformation. The feast that followed was excessive even by imperial standards. Tables sagged under the weight of roasted peacocks, exotic fruits, an amphory of wine from every province of the empire. Entertainers performed acrobatics, recited poetry, and sang in praise of the couple. Every toast was to the emperor and his empress, and every guest played their part, no matter how much the words burned on their tongues. For Sporus, the day was both surreal and terrifying. The layers of silk and gold were heavy, the jewels of physical weight pressing against his skin. He had been trained to smile, to offer polite nods, to play the role expected of him, but beneath the surface, the reality was inescapable. He was not a bride, not a partner, but a possession. This possession was soon put on display in the most public way possible. Nero took Sporus everywhere, to the theater, to the races, to official ceremonies. The emperor relished the shock his marriage produced, treating it as a kind of ongoing performance art. Sporus, in turn, was expected to behave exactly as Poppaea would have, sitting beside Nero in the imperial box, receiving petitions from citizens, even accepting gifts from foreign envoys. There was a cruel genius in this arrangement. By placing Sporus so visibly at his side, Nero forced Rome's elite to participate in the illusion. To speak against it was to insult the emperor's judgment and, in effect, to challenge his divine authority. The safest course was silence, and so the pretense held. Yet the effect on Sporus himself was corrosive. In private, he was surrounded by attendants who addressed him as Augusta and treated him with the deference due an empress. But these courtesies were a cage, not a kindness. Every gesture reinforced the fiction that had been built around him. Every mirror reflected not the boy he had been, but the role he had been forced to inhabit. To survive, Sporus learned the art of emotional concealment. He smiled when required, spoke only when it was safe, and never let his true feelings surface in a room where they could be used against him. This mask of compliance became his shield, but it also risked becoming his identity. Over time, the boundaries between the self he remembered and the self he performed began to blur. Nero's attachment to him was both obsessive and unstable. At times, he showered Sporus with gifts, villas, servants, silks imported from the East. At others, he flew into rages if Sporus failed to respond in exactly the way Poppaea might have. The expectation was not merely that Sporus look like her, but that he think like her, feel like her, exist as her in every moment. The court whispered, as courts always do. Some claimed that Sporus was the emperor's truest love, that Nero had found a way to conquer even death by remaking Poppaea in flesh. Others said he was a living humiliation for Rome, a sign that the emperor's madness had no limits. Both views carried an element of truth. And then came the moment when the fiction turned into something darker still. Nero announced that Sporus would accompany him on a grand tour of Greece, a journey meant to showcase the emperor's artistic talents in the homeland of theater and poetry. For Sporus, this meant months of travel, each city presenting a new audience for the performance. Everywhere they went, the ceremonies were repeated. Sporus was introduced as Sabina, and his presence lent Nero's appearances a strange, unsettling glamour. The crowds, caught between fascination and disbelief, cheered anyway. In a society where dissent could mean death, applause was the safest response. But even as the public void held, the empire itself was beginning to fracture. Discontent simmered among the military and the provinces. The treasury was strained from years of extravagance, and whispers of rebellion grew louder. For Sporus, none of this brought hope. He knew that his fate was tied entirely to Nero's. If the emperor fell, he would fall to whether as a political liability, a symbol of the old regime, or simply a loose end to be tied off. In quiet moments, he may have wondered if there was any path back to the life he had once known. But in the world of imperial Rome, the past was a luxury the powerless could not afford. Survival meant playing the role, even as the stage itself began to crack beneath their feet. The first cracks in Nero's reign were small enough to ignore: a mutiny in a distant province, complaints about taxes from senators who had once been his most enthusiastic supporters, a few grumbles from generals who resented being overshadowed by an emperor more interested in poetry competitions than military campaigns. But cracks, left untended, spread. By 68 CE, the empire was trembling. The legions in Gaul, loyal for decades, suddenly declared allegiance to a governor named Galba. It was a bold move, but bolder still was the Senate's reaction. For the first time, it openly turned against the emperor. Nero had faced plots before, but this was different. The rebellion wasn't confined to whispered conspiracies and darkened villas. It was marching toward Rome in broad daylight. The imperial court, once a place of sycophantic certainty, became a nest of frightened opportunists. Allies vanished overnight. Friends suddenly remembered old grievances. Through all this, Sporus remained at Nero's side, whether from loyalty, fear, or the absence of any other option. He stayed close as the emperor's world narrowed to a handful of rooms guarded by men whose loyalty could not be guaranteed. Nero, still convinced he could win the people back, tried to rally support with promises of reform. But the people's patience had long since expired. The riots that followed were small at first, then spread like wildfire. Statues of the emperor were torn down. His name was scratched from monuments. In the streets, the once unthinkable was shouted openly: "Death to Nero." The emperor began to lose his grip not just on power, but on reality. He paced through the palace at night, muttering lines of tragic verse, imagining himself the hero of a story that was slipping beyond his control. Sporus, ever the silent witness, played his part, offering comfort when required, holding his tongue when the emperor spiraled into rants against invisible enemies. The final blow came when the Senate declared Nero a public enemy. To be denounced in such a way was more than a political defeat, it was a death sentence. Every guard, every servant, every senator now had imperial permission to remove him by any means. Nero fled the city with only a handful of companions, Sporus among them. They rode through the night, the once gilded emperor now disguised in a simple tunic, hood pulled low to hide his face. It was a surreal reversal, the ruler of the known world reduced to a fugitive. Clinging to the shadows, they took refuge in the villa of a loyal freedman. But the sound of horses in the distance told them the reprieve would be brief. Nero, unwilling to face the public humiliation of capture, resolved to end his life. Yet even in this final act, he hesitated. It is one thing to speak of a noble death, quite another to take the fatal step. In the end, with soldiers already at the gates, Nero turned to one of his companions for help in driving the dagger home. His last words, according to legend, were not political, not defiant, but theatrical. Qualis artifex preo. What an artist dies in me. For Sporus, the moment was more than the death of an emperor. It was the collapse of the reality he had been forced to inhabit. The role of Empress evaporated in an instant, leaving him once again as simply Sporus, yet the freedom was hollow. Nero's enemies would see him not as an innocent, but as a living reminder of the regime they had just destroyed. In the dangerous vacuum that followed, Sporus was taken in by Otho, a man who had once been both Nero's ally and rival. Otho had known Poppaea personally, and perhaps the resemblance was part of why he wanted Sporus in his household. To outsiders, it looked like a transfer of property, the Empress moving from one master to another. Otho treated him with outward courtesy, but the undercurrent of possession remained. There was no question of Sporus returning to anonymity. His identity had been too public, too politicized, to simply vanish. And so he entered a new chapter, one where survival would require navigating the ambitions of men who saw him less as a person than as a symbol, a tool to be used in their own struggles for power. If Nero's court had been a theater, Otho's was a battlefield in disguise. The new emperor's reign was immediately challenged by Vitellius, another claimant to the throne, and the empire plunged into the chaos of civil war. For Sporus, the danger was no longer just the whims of one unstable ruler, it was the shifting tides of entire armies. It would not be long before the next storm broke over his head. Otho's reign began not with the applause of a grateful empire, but with the rumble of war drums. The Senate had accepted him, the Praetorian Guard had installed him, but beyond Rome, legions loyal to Vitellius were already on the march. The empire was split in two, and every citizen knew that only one man would walk away from the coming clash. For Sporus, Otho's court felt different from Nero's. The excesses were muted, the theatrical performances replaced with urgent councils of war. But in private, Otho still indulged in the symbols of imperial luxury, and Sporus, in his strange role as a living memento of Poppaea, was one such symbol. No one knew exactly why Otho kept him so close. Some whispered it was nostalgia, others suggested it was a way to assert continuity with Nero's image. A more cynical view was that Otho simply enjoyed flaunting the possession of something or someone that had once belonged to his rival. In politics, even human lives could be trophies. But Sporus knew better than to mistake proximity for security. The palace was full of eyes, each pair calculating whether Otho's rule would last, each willing to trade loyalty for survival if Vitellius emerged victorious. And so Sporus kept his head down, his words few, and his presence minimal. The inevitable came swiftly. Otho's forces clashed with Vitellius's in northern Italy, and the result was decisive. Otho, facing defeat, took his own life rather than plunge the empire deeper into civil war. It was a death framed as noble self-sacrifice, but for those in his household, it meant only one thing: they were now spoils for the victor. When Vitellius entered Rome, it was as a conqueror who wanted to make an example of everything associated with his enemies. He was not a man of delicate sensibilities. The new emperor's reputation for cruelty preceded him. He relished public humiliation as both entertainment and a political tool. And then Vitellius heard of Sporus. To Vitellius, Sporus was not a person, he was a curiosity, a scandal, a walking reminder of imperial perversion. Where Nero had cast Sporus as a mock empress, Vitellius saw the opportunity for a different kind of spectacle. According to some accounts, he planned to force Sporus into the arena during the Saturnalia festival, dressed in the robes of a bride, only to be assaulted in front of a roaring crowd. It was to be part punishment, part theater, part grotesque parody of Nero's marriage. The plan was horrifying in its simplicity. Take the most private violation and make it a public entertainment. It was the Roman appetite for blood and humiliation distilled into a single act. For Sporus, the news must have landed like a death sentence. There was no courtly game to play here, no chance to talk his way out. Vitellius was not Nero. He had no sentimental attachment, no emotional entanglement to exploit. This was not a ruler who could be swayed by beauty or loyalty, only by the satisfaction of his own cruelty. In that moment, Sporus faced the stark truth that had been building for years. As long as he lived, his existence could be used as a weapon against him. The role that had once been imposed upon him by Nero now served as an anchor, dragging him toward a degradation even worse than anything he had already endured. The choice that lay ahead was grim but clear. And in the Roman world, where honor was measured in control over one's own fate, there was one final way to deny Vitellius the satisfaction he sought. That decision, the last act of agency Sporus would ever take, was already forming in his mind. The days that followed Vitellius' victory were a haze of dread. For those in the defeated Emperor's household, some were executed immediately, their fates sealed by old grudges. Others were paraded through the streets in chains, offered up as living warnings to anyone who might dream of rebellion. And Sporus, he was kept alive, but not out of mercy. Word of Vitellius' planned wedding to Sporus spread through Rome like wildfire. The city's appetite for spectacle was as relentless as the emperor's cruelty, and the notion of a public mockery of Nero's infamous marriage was irresistible to the gossip-hungry crowds. To them, it was theater. To Sporus, it was annihilation. He had lived for years in the role of someone else's creation, a body shaped by imperial will, a life dictated by the whims of men who could command armies with a gesture. Now, stripped of even the pretense of dignity, he faced being turned into a joke that would echo for decades, perhaps centuries. The thought was unbearable. Roman culture held one peculiar form of resistance available to those trapped in hopeless situations: self-determined death. In a world where public shame could be more feared than the grave, ending one's own life was seen, especially among the elite, as a way to reclaim a final shred of control. It was, in a brutal way, the last theater one could direct oneself. Sporus made his choice. Ancient sources differ on the method. Some suggest he took poison, others that he simply refused to eat until his body gave way. Whatever the means, the message was the same. He would not give Vitellius his spectacle. The arena would not see his humiliation, the crowd would not get its roar, and the emperor would be denied the grotesque wedding he had so eagerly planned. When word reached Vitellius that Sporus was dead, there was no recorded lament, no public mourning, only the quiet irritation of a man whose performance had been spoiled before it could be staged. For Sporus, though, death was not defeat. It was the one act in his life that was wholly his own. The historical record of Sporus ends here, in the stillness after a final decision. His life, brief and unwillingly extraordinary, leaves us with more questions than answers. Was he a victim from beginning to end, or did he wield quiet influence behind the scenes? Was his death an act of despair, or a calculated final strike against the men who sought to use him? In the centuries since, Sporus has been remembered mostly as a footnote to Nero's excesses, a curiosity in the annals of imperial decadence. But when we strip away the sensationalism, what remains is the story of a person caught in the machinery of absolute power, reshaped, renamed, and reimagined to suit the narratives of others. And perhaps that is why his story still resonates. In every age, there are those whose identities are overwritten by forces beyond their control, whose value is measured not by their own humanity, but by what they can represent. To someone more powerful, Sporus' life is a stark reminder of what happens when a person becomes an object in someone else's performance. History records emperors as the shapers of destiny, but here in the shadow of Nero and Vitellius, we see the truth from another angle, that the power to control a life is not the same as the power to define it. In denying Vitellius' final act, Sporus reclaimed, in the smallest but most essential way, the authorship of his own story. It is a small victory, perhaps, but in a life where almost nothing was his to decide, it is a victory all the same. The camera would pull back now, leaving the marble corridors and blood-stained arenas behind, fading from the firelit faces of emperors to the quieter, almost invisible presence of the one they all thought they could control. Sporus' life was not measured in years. He lived barely into his 20s, but in the way it was constantly rewritten by others. First by Nero, who refashioned him into an empress, then by Otho, who kept him as a living relic, and finally by Vitellius, who sought to turn him into a spectacle so grotesque that it would mock both the man and the memory of Rome as most notorious ruler. He was, to them, never quite a person, always a role, a possession, a symbol to be displayed or destroyed. And yet, in the end, the man history remembers as Sporus made the one choice no emperor couldn't do. He denied them their closing act. He refused to be the scene they had written for him. Perhaps that is why his story, pulled from the margins of dusty chronicles, still stirs something in us. We are used to history being told by its victors, by the powerful who shape events and decide which lives are worth recording. But Sporus reminds us that even in a world where your identity is stolen, your body altered, and your life stage managed, there is still a kind of power in the refusal to perform. It is not the kind of victory that makes statues or triumphal arches. It will not be etched into coins or celebrated in Senate decrees. But it is the kind of victory that belongs entirely to the one who claims it. And so, 2,000 years later, his story lingers not because of the emperors who tried to possess him, but because, at the very end, he reminded them of something they could never quite accept. That a person, however broken, however cornered, can still choose the terms of their exit.